Have you ever wondered how much sleep you really need for optimal health and well-being? We often hear that modern people like you and me are not getting nearly enough sleep and that this is very, very bad for our health. And of course, partly that's true. But what if I told you that sleeping too much might actually be even worse for your health? In this video series, we're going to be exploring how to sleep optimally for your health, well-being, and performance. And in today's video, we're specifically going to look at what the scientific evidence actually says on balance about how much sleep we really need and why it's so disastrous for our health when we sleep too little or too much. Hey everyone, this is Timo here. Welcome back to Integral Wellbeing. I've personally battled with insomnia and bad sleep for most of my life, so I really had to figure out what the science says and what would help me get better sleep. And sleep is definitely not for lazy people. We all need it to function our best. In fact, it's true for pretty much all living things on Earth. As most sleep experts will point out, sleep is so important to our biology that pretty much every living organism has to sleep, apart from a few weird exceptions. Evolution has kept this weird habit in place, even though it carries so many risks. If you think about it, when you're asleep, you're basically immobile and unconscious for many hours every night. You could be easily attacked by predators and all sorts of bad things can happen. So if evolution could have cut back this habit, it would have been really advantageous. And yet it hasn't done that. And so it's not very surprising that when you deprive a person of sleep entirely for a day, the health impact of that is far greater than depriving a person of food for a day or exercise for a day. Therefore, it's kind of interesting that human beings seem to be the only species that deliberately deprives itself of sleep for no apparent gain. Now, one of the most popular books in this area is Matthew Walker's Why We Sleep, which a lot of people nowadays have read, and has sort of brought this issue into public consciousness. I read the book myself, and I was profoundly convinced by its compelling arguments. As I started digging more into the literature, I discovered that there were quite a number of scientists who had serious concerns about Walker's book, and who felt that he was kind of exaggerating the harms of not sleeping enough, and was overlooking the harms of sleeping too much. Some people felt that this book could actually create unnecessary sleep anxiety for everyone who was not getting the perfect 8 hours of sleep every night. And I think it actually happened to myself. Any night that I would get less than 8 hours, I would be worried that I was harming my health. But luckily, it doesn't seem to be so black and white. But let's first give Walker his due. He has a point. Modern life has clearly significantly disrupted our natural sleeping patterns as a species. In most modern environments, we are exposed to light sources all day, every day, and even at night, which is completely unnatural for us. We mostly live in highly regulated, cushy environments where the temperature stays constant throughout the day, so we don't even experience the natural cycles in warmth and cold, which would normally happen in nature. And also, quite different from our hunter-gatherer ancestors, we are exposed to chronic levels of stress. It seems that hunter-gatherers mostly experienced acute bouts of stress, and the fact that chronic stress has a negative effect on the quality and quantity of our sleep is very well documented. Now, despite all of this, unfortunately, modern science and modern medicine has not provided very much for us to help with this situation. It has been ignoring sleep for centuries. As Peter Attia shows in his recent book Outlive, even just 20 years ago, we didn't know much of anything about why we sleep and why it's so important for our health and performance. And the main tool that modern medicine provides for helping with sleep problems is a class of sleep medications that not only do they not work, they are actually very harmful. The US sleep medication market is capped at around $28 billion a year. And according to Dr. Michael Greger, up to 10% of the US population take these medications regularly. The trouble is that these sleep medications are in a class of drugs called hypnotics, which actually don't induce healthy, normal sleep, but rather a kind of drug-induced unconsciousness. And as Dr. Michael Greger points out, there are dozens of studies showing that there's a strong association between taking these drugs and premature death. So if, as these studies suggest, these drugs are actually killing people, they could be responsible for hundreds of thousands of deaths every year around the world. Now, on a rosier note, modern science has now been able to use modern technologies to actually study hunter-gatherer societies that still sleep in this natural way that our ancestors probably did, and were able to find what that pattern was. And they discovered that these societies spread all over the world have pretty much the same basic sleep pattern, and it's not what you would expect. So if you want to find out what our natural ancestral sleep pattern is, make sure you stay tuned until the end of the video. Now, before we look at what our species' original sleep pattern was, let's first look at what the science says about what happens to you when you sleep clearly too little. As Dr. Greger shows in his book How Not to Age, inadequate sleep is clearly associated with a vast number of acute and chronic health conditions that could increase our risk of death and disease. In fact, just making people sleep 5 hours a night for a week has the same kind of health impact as having diabetes, having heart disease, or smoking. Yet more than a quarter of the US population routinely gets less than 6 hours of sleep a night. Now, of course, most of us are familiar with the fact that when we don't sleep enough, we notice it in our immune system. We tend to get the cold or the flu more quickly. But actually, the biggest effects on our health of not getting enough sleep seem to be in our circulation and our metabolic health. As Greger says, the most dire effect may be endothelial function. In other words, the ability of your blood vessels to efficiently pump blood throughout the body. And one of the most consistent findings in sleep research is that depriving people of sleep reliably induces metabolic dysfunction, such as insulin resistance, all the way up to type 2 diabetes. Insulin resistance is basically where your body becomes insensitive to the signal of the hormone insulin, making it less efficient at storing away glucose that piles up in the bloodstream. As Peter Attia says in his book Outlive, no fewer than 9 studies have shown that sleep deprivation can increase insulin resistance by up to a third. And multiple large meta-analyses have shown that there's a clear relationship between sleep deprivation and type 2 diabetes or metabolic syndrome. Now, what's crazy is that this can actually happen in the short term. The famous sleep scientist Eve Van Cotter and her research group at Chicago was able to show that making people sleep only 4.5 hours a night for 4 days could reliably make healthy young people have elevated insulin like middle-aged obese diabetics and reduce their ability to clear glucose from the bloodstream by 50%. Now, insulin resistance is not just harmful to your metabolism, but has been implicated in increasing your risk of other chronic conditions like obesity and heart disease. And so there's also a clear relationship between sleep deprivation and obesity, increasing your risk of obesity by as much as 38%. Eve Van Cotter and her research group were also able to show that if you let people only sleep 4 to 5 hours a night, it suppresses the release of the hormone leptin, which gives us the feeling that we are full after we've eaten. In other words, satiety. And increases the production of the hormone ghrelin, which makes us hungrier. And so they were actually able to show that sleeping so little makes people eat as much as 300 calories more the very next day. No wonder you're going to gain weight. Another thing that poor sleep seems to do reliably is increasing our blood pressure. The main reason for this seems to be that when we are sleep deprived, we are overactivating our sympathetic nervous system, in other words, our fight or flight mode, causing the hormone cortisol to elevate our heart rate and blood pressure. Now, as I mentioned, there's also many studies showing a clear relationship between not sleeping enough and heart disease, which is the main killer of men and women worldwide. However, what's cool is that we actually also have studies showing that when you make people sleep adequately, 6 to 9 hours by the researchers' definition, you actually see people's risk of heart disease reduce, even in people who have a clear genetic predisposition for the disease. So this really suggests it's probably cause and effect. Now, on a completely different note, there's also a lot of evidence showing that not sleeping enough is gonna make your skin look older and flabbier, in Attia's words. So it does make you less beautiful. Now, perhaps the scariest effect of sleep deprivation is on our mind and our brain. According to Peter Attia, who is a physician who specializes in longevity medicine, poor sleep is both an early symptom and a potential cause of Alzheimer's disease and dementia. The main reason for this seems to be that when we are not getting enough deep non-REM sleep, which is the kind of sleep where our brain cycles through extremely slow brain waves of 1 to 4 seconds, During this kind of deep non-REM sleep, the most important kind of neurological repair takes place. It's also the time when our short-term memories get stored into our long-term memory. So you can actually show that when you deprive people of deep sleep, they perform worse on a memory test the very next day. Now, sleep disturbances often precede the diagnosis of dementia and cognitive impairment by many years, and our ability to get deep sleep seems to decline with age, although we're not sure whether that is because people are just aging or because as they age, they tend to accumulate chronic health issues that reduce the quality of their sleep. And meanwhile, we actually also have direct studies showing that improving the sleep quality and quantity in older adults actually decreases risk of Alzheimer's and dementia. So in Peter Attia's practice, which is very much focused on prevention, improving sleep is one of the main tools he uses for Alzheimer's prevention. Another crazy effect on our mind and brain of sleep deprivation is our emotional health. As it turns out, towards the later stages of sleep, when we go through so-called REM sleep, rapid eye movement sleep, when we're dreaming, we are processing our emotional memories, which helps to separate the emotions from the actual events taking place. We remember the event, but we hopefully forget the pain and the distress associated with it, so that whenever we recall that memory, we won't be flooded by intense emotion every time. And so apparently you can actually show that people who are suffering from PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, they have vastly reduced REM sleep, so they're not as able to separate the emotion from the actual event in their memories. Another crazy thing that happens when we are deprived of REM sleep is that we become less able to interpret other people's facial expressions. People who are deprived of REM sleep seem to interpret neutral and friendly faces more often as hostile. Now, another thing worth thinking about if you're an active person is that sleep deprivation clearly increases your risk of injury. A 2014 study showed that athletes who were sleeping less than 6 hours a night had a more than 2.5 times greater risk of developing an injury. And of course, as Matthew Walker points out, drowsy driving is responsible for hundreds of thousands of traffic accidents every year. This is of course very interesting, looking at the relationship between sleep and chronic diseases, but can you actually show that people are dying more often or not living as long? Matthew Walker makes the bold claim in his book that the shorter your sleep, the shorter your lifespan. However, he doesn't cite any studies to support this claim, and other scientists who have reviewed his book say it's just not true. The Encyclopedia of Sleep, which Walker cites multiple times throughout his book, says the popular expectation that short sleep is correlated with short lifespan and long sleep with greater longevity is not supported by the existing literature. Greger says pretty much the same. Whether or not the link between sleep and mortality is cause and effect remains controversial. The most consistent finding, according to Greger, is that there's no association at all between sleep duration and mortality, how much people are dying. Part of the reason why this is the case is probably that most of these studies are asking people to self-report on how much sleep they're getting every night, because it's basically impossible to do objective sleep measurements on a large number of people. Now, it's very hard to prove causality like this because we know from other studies that people are extremely bad at remembering how much sleep they actually got. In one famous study, the correlation between how much sleep people said they got and how much they actually got based on the measurements was 0.47. That means there's barely a connection. Okay, so the most common finding is that there's no relationship really between sleep duration and mortality. However, the surprising thing is that the second most common finding is that there is clearly a relationship between sleeping too long and mortality, typically more than 9 hours a night. And about a quarter of the findings, according to Greger, show that there's a U-shaped relationship between mortality and sleep duration. In other words, the people who are not getting enough sleep and the people who are getting too much sleep are both dying at a higher rate than the people in the sweet spot in the middle. And less than 5% of the findings only found a relationship between mortality and not enough sleep. So actually there's more scientific evidence to support that getting too much sleep is bad for you than the idea that not getting enough is bad for you. Now again, it's difficult to prove cause and effect. Now, one of the main reasons for this, according to Greger, is that people who sleep too much, more than 9 hours a night, also tend to be physically inactive, diabetic, obese, and depressed and unmarried, So these things could actually be explaining why sleeping too much is associated with dying sooner. Okay, so you might be thinking, I get it. Sleeping far too little and sleeping way too much is obviously bad for you. But what is really the sweet spot then? How much do humans really need to sleep when nothing interferes with our natural rhythms? As it turns out, scientists recently were actually able to answer this question. A group of scientists were able to study 3 pre-industrial hunter-gatherer societies that were completely isolated from each other across 2 continents, and they found that they had pretty much the exact same sleep pattern. The people they studied, the Hadza of Tanzania, the San of the Kalahari, and the Tsimane of Bolivia, all live around the equator, where our species evolved for most of our evolutionary history. So the scientists gave all these people Acti watches, which are these devices that measure skin temperature, light exposure, and all sorts of things, and have been scientifically validated with polysomnography that they actually accurately track the number of sleep people are getting. And so guess what they found? People in these societies slept on average only 6.5 hours a night, between 5.7 and 7.1 hours, and spent on average 7.5 hours in bed to get that much sleep, between 6.9 and 8.5 hours in bed. This is not the non-negotiable 8 hours of sleep that Matthew Walker was talking about. Now, as the researchers point out, this is near the low end of how much sleep people get in modern industrial societies. In fact, multiple other studies have questioned this idea that in modern times we are sleeping so much less than our ancestors. There's just not that much evidence that we are sleeping so much less, and there's quite a bit of evidence that we're actually sleeping more. Now, importantly, this might be because the quality of our sleep is so much worse, causing us to need more hours in the bed to get the same amount of rest. So when we look at these hunter-gatherer societies, all of them stayed up at least 3 hours after the sun already went down, staying awake while it was dark, and they all woke up about an hour before sunrise. They also seemed to fall asleep when it was coldest in the night, and they would wake up when the temperature started rising in the morning, causing the researchers to say that probably the natural temperature swings are an important cue to our body that it's time to go to sleep. They also got their most intense light exposure around 9 a.m. in the morning, and started seeking the shade after about noon. So the researchers again argue this is probably a habit that's good to replicate for people like ourselves. Maybe get some morning sunlight around that time. It was clear that their sleeping pattern also changed based on the seasons, causing them to sleep about an hour more in the winter versus the summer, which they mostly did by going to bed an hour earlier rather than waking up an hour later. People in industrial societies, for the most part, don't seem to do this. Also, what was interesting is that they didn't practice napping that much. Especially in the winter, they were only napping on about 7% of the days and would take a short nap of about 30 minutes on 22% of the days in the summer, mostly because it was so hot. As the researchers point out, all human beings actually experience a natural dip in alertness around the late afternoon, and this is genetically hardwired and has pretty much nothing to do with food intake. And so as the researchers say, and I quote, "Our findings indicate that sleep in industrial societies has not been reduced below a level that is normal for most of our species' evolutionary history." So in conclusion, we can say that getting less than 6 hours a night is probably negative for our health, well-being, and performance, and that sleeping more than 8 hours is probably unnecessary and could even be harmful. We can also say that our natural sweet spot seems to be around 7 hours of actual sleep, and that we're most likely to get that much sleep if we spend about 7 to 8 hours actually in the bed, depending on how fast you fall asleep. But whatever the science says and whatever the numbers are, if you feel consistently tired and drowsy throughout the day, you probably need more sleep. Most of the numbers mentioned in these studies are of course averages, and there really are individual differences between people. And of course, the number of hours we sleep doesn't take into account the quality of our sleep, which is arguably just as important, and which we'll therefore cover in our next video in this series. Now, if you like this video, please like, subscribe, comment, and share. And if you're interested in learning how to apply these principles into your own life using evidence-based behavior change strategies, I'm currently in the process of creating online courses where you will learn how to implement these principles into your own life in a truly effective and long-lasting way. So if you would like to be notified when these come out, please leave your email in the form in the description below. And stay tuned for the next video series where we'll look at why exercise might in fact be the most powerful intervention we have to improve our health and longevity.